The Prologue demo for Metaphor ReFantazio is out now, and I recommend anyone who is a fan of JRPGs or just Atlus in general to give it a try because I believe you will not be disappointed. You're going to get around 4 to 5 hours of content if you happen to listen to all the dialogue, thoroughly explore the areas that are available, complete the optional dungeon, and get to the end of the demo. I'm fairly certain, though, that there are going to be individuals that stretch this out as far as possible, possibly getting into the 6-hour mark, because there's a lot for the player to take in as this is a new IP. My impressions overall are very positive. It's going to feel very familiar to fans of the Shin Megami Tensei or Persona series. It honestly feels like a nice evolution of the different mechanics introduced in those games. Combat is fast and snappy and emphasizes synergy between archetypes, which are the classes that you'll unlock as you progress through the game and develop relationships with key characters. It does take a little while before the combat opens up, and I was concerned at the beginning that it was a little bit too familiar to other titles. But then I hit the Old Mines, which is the second major section of the demo, and the game introduces a number of different mechanics and systems. You learned through the tutorial section that positioning in combat matters because enemies can now just target a specific row instead of a character. You may also want to position specific archetypes in the back row to ensure they aren't taking the full brunt of an enemy's attack. Think of the mages, think of the healers. It's a really simple addition, but it does add a layer of strategy to a familiar system. When you get around 2 to 3 hours in, you're introduced to synergies, which are abilities that can be executed as long as there are compatible archetypes. This introduces another layer of strategy because while synergies are incredibly useful and effective, they are costly. And when you are utilizing a synergy, that MP cost is not one of those where it's cut in half between two characters. No, it is like 5 MP per character, which I was not paying attention to at first, which is why when I got to the end of one of the dungeons, I was like, oh shit, I have no MP anymore. So I could not continue on with the fight. You also have to bear in mind that utilizing these synergy abilities will also consume both characters' turn. So it's one of those things where you just can't play recklessly, and I really love this mechanic because there is a high risk, high reward. Sometimes you might knock an enemy down and you might get yourself another turn, or you might just do high damage and potentially prevent yourself from defending a character who will more than likely take a ton of damage due to their archetype. So there's something you have to pay attention to there. And the thing is, if you're familiar with Persona or Shin Megami Tensei, there's almost no way to recover MP without using consumables when you're exploring a dungeon. So if you hated that mechanic, if you did not like that system, it makes a return here. So you really need to pay attention to your MP consumption while you're working through a dungeon, while you're working in combat. So while synergies are enticing and effective, they are costly, so you really have to pay attention to what you're doing, which is something I really like. And overall, I thought the additions to combat were good and represented a step forward for Atlus and their JRPG formula. Now, when it comes to the dungeon exploration and engaging enemies prior to entering combat, I think the changes here are less pronounced, but they're still welcome. Dungeons are still linear, but they feel more connected, and you're constantly being teased with hidden passages because there are treasure chests and other items that are out of reach and require the player to thoroughly explore, otherwise you're going to miss out on some key items. It's not just going around and just finding a key. There are actually hidden passages that you can scan for in the environment. You just have to be thorough when you're doing so. Like in previous titles, you are able to engage enemies before entering combat. The changes here, I think, are impactful primarily because instead of just being able to one-tap an enemy and enter combat, enemies that are your level or higher are going to require a number of hits to stun if you are not attacking from behind. But even if you do happen to stun them, you can now choose whether or not to enter combat, which is something that is massive given the fact that in these games, especially the Persona series, dungeon exploration is resource intensive the further you go down. So, being able to stun an enemy and run is a change that I really appreciate, because one of the things that I've always felt was missing was the option to not really engage. Now, you can't always just run past an enemy, but here, enemies get really aggressive and they can leap and attack you very quickly. It happened a couple times, which I was very surprised by. but the fact that I can stun an enemy, get that little slowdown where it shows an enemy stunned midair, you can just press circle or B or whatever it is to dodge out of the way, and then you can just continue exploring, which is something that I thought was amazing and something I really didn't play with enough when I was going through some of the dungeons. And although it represents a small change, I think it's really impactful because if you think about it, being able to run away, conserve resources, allows the player to be strategic in regards to engaging enemies and also exploring a dungeon thoroughly because you don't want to just constantly go back and forth. That was like my main complaint, and it has always been kind of my one big issue with Persona and Shin Megami Tensei or any other Atlus JRPGs, is that you only have so much time before essentially you're just out of resources to explore. But here, because you can now choose not to engage in combat, you can kind of do whatever you want, and this allows you to get through these areas quicker. And I think that's going to be beneficial for the player and just more satisfying than me fighting the same enemy over and over again. I really like this change, and I'm hoping that they implement this in future JRPG titles moving forward. Now, outside of combat, I was honestly surprised with the amount of things that the Prologue demo allowed you to do. In fact, I was just kind of surprised about the length of the demo to begin with. I was expecting, with the JRPG, an hour. But here we got pretty much the first small section of the game, like the opening hours. And in that time frame, you're going to explore the world capital of Grand Trad, complete side quests, purify equipment, appraise items, increase your royal virtues, which are essentially your social stats, meet new followers, deepen your relationships, and explore an optional dungeon. Every time I thought the demo was going to end, it just kept going, and I was honestly blown away by the content here. And I didn't fully explore it either. I was just kind of like, we have to stop this eventually. This feels like I'm going on for far too long. I could have easily hit the 6-hour mark if I wanted to. The demo ends on a cliffhanger after, in my opinion, a really easy boss fight. But regardless, I was really impressed by what was here. In the time I spent with the demo, I became invested in this new fantasy setting created by Atlus, and I was really impressed by the narrative and just how grim and grounded it was. I understand that Atlus has never shied away from darker themes or subjects, which is something I've always loved about their different series, but they pretty much throw you into dire straits here in Metaphor almost immediately. The opening cutscene was pretty brutal. It was honestly kind of surprising that it opened in the way it did, and it just rolls on from there. I love the fact that they are embracing a dark fantasy, and if the prologue is any indication on how the rest of the game is going to go, this honestly might end up as Atlus's darkest work to date. If you're wondering why I'm trying to be as vague as possible when describing the narrative or anything that has to do with the characters or the interactions with those characters, it's because I want to remain spoiler-free, which is why most of the footage you're seeing in the background is going to be combat. I think if the demo had ended before the return to the Royal Capital, I would be more comfortable showing off some of the opening content, but I do understand that there are players who are going to try to go into this blind, and I want to be considerate of those people. So before I end the video, I do want to talk about the production values because I do believe that this is going to be Atlus's most ambitious title to date. When Persona 3 Reload released earlier in 2024, I was blown away by the game's in-game visuals, how stylish the menus were, and I thought the remixed music was fantastic. With all that being said, I think Metaphor is going to absolutely crush P3 Reload in every aspect. I love how this game looks. The character models look great. I think the character designs are fantastic. The in-game cutscenes were really fun. The character portraits especially are amazing. They're really well detailed. I really feel like there's so much visual variety found here, and I feel like the artists were given enough space to really express themselves in regard to this new fantasy setting. I won't lie when I say that the different menus found in this game are amazing. I don't know why the development team, or just Atlus in general, felt like it was necessary to recently start to create different pieces of art for each menu, but I'm a huge fan of this. I ended up scrolling through the different menus just so I could see what new piece of art was going to pop up, and I was never disappointed because what is here is phenomenal. When it comes to music, I was equally impressed. There are some excellent pieces found here, and I think what blew my mind, it was really hard for me to wrap my head around, was that this was just the prologue. I let every single cutscene play out because the music was so good. And I even lingered on certain cutscenes that featured no spoken dialogue because the music that accompanied that scene was fantastic. I honestly have no clue how many different musical pieces were composed for Metaphor, but I feel like in a game that is more than likely going to hit the 50 to 60 hour mark on the first playthrough, there's going to be a lot. I don't think it's going to challenge Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which I think had over 200 pieces. But I'm honestly not going to be surprised if it gets close to over 100 musical compositions, because it just felt like in the first couple of hours, there was a lot of new music, and it was just so good to listen to. And I'm wondering if Atlus is going to release the OST for Metaphor shortly after its release. I think that would be really cool. Now, while I am a fan and am curious to see what's going to happen with the presentation moving forward for Metaphor, I will say there were probably two things that I was not keen on. One was the combat menu. Don't get me wrong, it's stylish, it's colorful, it pops off the screen, but for some reason, and I can't put my finger on it, I'm just not a fan. I think it's kind of distracting. And listen, I totally understand that there are going to be people out there who will love the combat menu. But for me, it's just something I'm not a big fan of, and it's just my personal opinion. It's not even really a gripe. It's just one of those things where I'm looking at it and saying to myself, this could have been done a little cleaner. The other part of the presentation that I'm not really a fan of are the anime cutscenes. It's not that it's bad, but I don't believe the quality found here is as good or as impactful as what's found in-game. The in-game cutscenes, in my opinion, range from good to great. There's a really impactful scene near the end of the prologue that I loved, and then it was followed up by an anime cutscene in which I felt like there was a slight drop-off in quality, which is kind of weird if you think about it. Usually, when you're splicing in and mixing in these two different medias, like the anime cutscene, which is more than likely going to cost more, should be of a higher quality, but for whatever reason, it just didn't feel like it. When you look at Metaphor ReFantazio and you're seeing how the game is set in this new world and how it really feels like the art team is going all out to bring this world to life, I really feel like presentation-wise, this is going to be Atlus's biggest game to date. And so you're going to see a number of new things happen, especially with the implementation of anime cutscenes and in-game stuff. And I really felt like if you're going to include a number of anime cutscenes, which they do in the opening prologue, it needs to be as good or better than the in-game cutscenes. And I didn't feel that way when I was playing through the prologue. But overall, I thought the presentation and the production values were fantastic. I firmly believe that developers and publishers need to put out demos, especially with the cost of these games today, because it allows the player to get an idea of how a title is going to play and perform. For new IPs, it's especially important regardless of the developer's history, because these new games generally deviate heavily from their past work. Now, in regard to Metaphor ReFantazio, it's not going to feel like a massive change from previous Atlus games, but it does feel like a step forward. And because the prologue runs 4 to 5 hours, you are going to be able to make an informed decision. And I think that's very important when it comes to these games that are going to be 50 to 60 to 100 hours long. You want to be able to make an informed decision because the cost of playing these games, these investments that you have to put in regard to hours, are so high, which is exactly what I did when I pre-ordered the game. I am very excited for the full release. I think I was sold on Metaphor ReFantazio in the first hour or so, and I think it would be a waste to put in that many hours and not pick it up. I'm just making a sensible decision here. But let me know what you think in the comments, because that is going to do it for this video. If you happen to like the content, please consider like, sharing, and subscribing. It really helps out the channel. I'm Ken from Pixelated Thoughts. I'll talk to you next time.